When the truck rolled to a stop, its engine coughed out a final breath and fell silent. Around it, bodies lay still on the pavement, some crumpled mid-step, others frozen where they'd fallen. But she didn't run. She didn't cry. She didn't even flinch. She just sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes steady, as if she'd simply completed something long overdue. And when the police arrived, startled and shaken by the scene before them, she looked up and met their gaze without a flicker of fear. "I meant to do it," she said. No hesitation, no apology, just a sentence that would mark the beginning of one of the most disturbing chapters in Czechoslovakia's modern history. Her name was Olga Hepnarova, just 23 years old. She'd been born in a city scarred by war and raised in a household that looked ordinary, but never felt like home. And what she did that day wouldn't just shock the country. It would earn her a grim title, the last woman ever executed in Czechoslovakia. This wasn't an act of rage, it wasn't impulsive, it wasn't chaotic, it was methodical, cold, intentional. 2 days before the attack, Olga had mailed handwritten letters to several newspapers. These weren't pleas for help, they were declarations, calm, calculated and chilling. "I, Olga Hepnarova, the victim of your cruelty, sentence you to death," she wrote. Not a confession, a verdict. Not a scream, but a final statement from someone who was sentenced long before she ever passed judgment on others. So what brings someone to that edge, the kind of edge that makes turning back impossible? This isn't a horror story about a masked killer. It's not about madness in disguise. It's about something quieter, more haunting. It's about what happens when someone spends so long unseen, unheard, untouched, that they begin to disappear and then finally explode into visibility. Olga Hepnarova came into the world in 1951 in Prague, a city still coated in post-war silence. Her early life didn't signal anything out of the ordinary. Her father worked in finance, her mother was a dentist, they had enough to get by. To others, they probably looked like a typical post-war family rebuilding normalcy. But behind the walls of their home, there was a different kind of silence, a colder one. Olga wasn't rebellious. She didn't act out. She simply withdrew. Even as a child, she hovered on the edges, watching others laugh, play, belong. She never stepped in, and nobody reached out. By the time she turned 13, the emotional weight she carried had become impossible to ignore. Her school life fractured, her energy drained, and eventually she was sent to a psychiatric institution for observation. For nearly a year, doctors watched her quietly suffer. Notes from the time describe her as emotionally flat, deeply isolated, struggling to express even basic thoughts. They discharged her eventually. But nothing had changed. She was still a girl stuck in a place where no one listened and no one knew how. Back home, the disconnect continued. She later told psychologists that living with her family felt suffocating, that she felt unseen, unloved, unheard. And in a country where mental health was still a taboo, her quiet despair was treated more like a phase than a cry for help. As she moved into adulthood, Olga tried to blend in. She looked for jobs, tried different routines, tried to be what everyone else seemed to be. But each attempt ended the same way, with rejection, misunderstanding, and deeper withdrawal. She couldn't hold a job, not because she didn't want to, but because the environments never fit. People found her strange, she found them distant, and the divide only widened. Her days became routines of emptiness, long walks, empty rooms, park benches where she sat alone, watching strangers pass by, living lives she couldn't touch. Not yet angry, just tired, just fading. When she turned 21, she found brief solace in an unlikely place, behind the wheel of a truck. Driving gave her space. The solitude wasn't threatening. It was relief. No small talk, no performance, just long stretches of road and the hum of the engine. For a while, that silence was enough. But silence, when it's all you have, eventually turns into something sharper. By her early 20s, she was barely there. No real friends, no emotional ties, just routines that blurred into each other and days that passed without a single soul acknowledging she existed. Her apartment was bare. Her conversations, if any, were short, stiff, uncomfortable. What she craved wasn't success or love or admiration. It was simple, to be seen, to matter. But day after day, the world looked past her, and when people did notice her, it was with discomfort, like she didn't belong. Neighbours described her as quiet and peculiar. Former employers said she was hard to talk to. Nobody suspected anything deeper than oddness. And that, more than anything, became the wound that never closed. In one of her early psychological evaluations, Olga wrote a sentence that would later send shivers down the spine of those who read it. "I live among people, but I am not one of them." This wasn't about excuses. It wasn't a deflection. It was an admission from someone who had walked every road available to her and found none that led home. What makes her case stand out to this day isn't just the act itself, it's the quiet build-up. So many who commit violent crimes leave trails of chaos, fights, threats, flashes of volatility. But Olga, she left a void. She disappeared in plain sight, and no one thought to look closer. Years later, analysts would study her handwriting, slanted, narrow, packed together, wondering if it hid clues. They reviewed school essays, childhood sketches, anything that might hint at what was to come. But the signs weren't there. Not anger, just absence. Just a soft and constant erosion of someone who once hoped to be loved. She wasn't always bitter, but slowly, piece by piece, she became so. Through every unanswered question, every meal eaten in silence, every door closed in her face, she stopped hoping, until finally she made a choice. Not to fade anymore, but to be noticed. In one of her final letters, just days before everything changed, she wrote, "I have been silent long enough. Now I will become the noise." And with that, a young woman who wanted nothing more than to belong stepped into infamy, not with a scream, but with a sentence the world would never forget. The first warning didn't arrive with flashing lights. No alarms, no chaos, just 2 envelopes, neatly sealed, quietly mailed. It was July 7th, 1973, when Olga Hepnarova walked into a post office and sent out her final message. 2 letters, both addressed to newspaper editors. Not confessions, not cries for sympathy, but statements, cold, measured and unsettling. Inside one of them, she wrote, "I am a loner, a woman destroyed by people. I have 2 options, end my own life or take others with me. I've chosen the latter. I sentence you to death." At the time, no one saw them. The letters wouldn't be opened until after the headlines had already begun to spread, after the damage was done, after the silence she carried had finally been shattered by the sound of screaming. When the editors finally read her words, it was like a second impact. The horror they now understood hadn't just happened, it had been promised, and no one had known to stop it. In the first wave of disbelief, people struggled to reconcile the image of Olga they thought they knew, a quiet, distant woman with no criminal record, no violent history, no public breakdowns, with the devastating reality she had created. To many, she was barely a memory, a shadow, someone they passed on the street and forgot before turning the corner. But as police began to unravel the details, the narrative shifted. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't madness erupting out of nowhere. It was preparation, methodical, unflinching. Olga had rented the truck legally, arrived at the office on time, paid in full with no questions asked. The paperwork was clean, her demeanour unremarkable. She drove away like someone on a normal errand. There were no signs of panic, no stalling, no second thoughts. When investigators searched her apartment, they weren't met with disarray or scribbled walls. They found journals, notes, marked calendars, old newspaper clippings. A mind not unravelling, but organising. She hadn't snapped. She'd been building towards something for years, slowly, quietly, like a wave rising just beneath the surface. To seasoned criminal psychologists, this was not unfamiliar. The calm isn't comforting, it's chilling, because it tells you this wasn't about losing control, it was about taking it back in the most violent way possible. Over the next few weeks, those who had known Olga, at least in passing, were re-interviewed. Details that once seemed harmless now took on new weight. A neighbour remembered her standing at a tram stop for nearly an hour, just staring. Another recalled how she always walked the same exact path every day, always at the same time. At first, it had seemed like a quirky routine. Now it looked like practice. Individually, those moments meant nothing. Together, they formed a blueprint. Even her letters, which had seemed like abstract despair at first glance, began to reveal a cold logic beneath the rage. These weren't the ramblings of someone breaking down. They were declarations from someone who had already made peace with their decision. Someone who believed society had judged her first, and now she was simply responding in kind. And that, more than anything, shook the public, because she hadn't hidden her pain. She hadn't disguised her intentions. She'd simply lived so quietly, so distantly, that no one had thought to look closely. She was a walking alarm, silent, unnoticed, and ultimately deadly. Experts couldn't agree on what exactly pushed her over the edge, but they all came to the same unsettling conclusion. Olga didn't see her actions as evil. She saw them as justified, as fair, as balanced. This wasn't revenge against one person. It was revenge against a world that in her eyes had abandoned her. And her plan? It was already in motion days before anyone knew her name. On the morning of July 10th, 1973, Olga entered a vehicle rental office in Prague. She handed over 260 crowns in cash. Her license checked out. Her demeanour was calm. She signed the papers, took the keys, and drove off without a single glance back. To the clerk behind the desk, she was just another customer. To Olga, this was the moment the silence ended. For nearly an hour, she drove the city streets, not wandering, not lost. She was watching, tracking foot traffic, noting busy stops, calculating where the most people stood and when. Several tram stops passed by her window. She kept driving. Then she found it. At the base of a sloping road in Prague 7, a tram stop came into view. It was tucked around a bend, nearly hidden from sight, a perfect blind spot. The hill above would give her speed. The curve would obscure her approach. All she had to do was wait. But the timing wasn't right. The crowd was too thin, so she circled the block again. This wasn't hesitation, it was execution. When she returned a second time, the scene had changed. More people, elderly men, office workers, mothers with children, all standing unaware, waiting for the next tram, waiting for something that would never come. Olga didn't slow down. The truck moved forward, steady, inevitable. Then in an instant, lives were taken, and the city stopped breathing. Panic rippled across the pavement. Sirens screamed through narrow streets. Onlookers shouted, cried, froze. Emergency crews tried to make sense of what had just happened. 9 people would lose their lives that day. Some were killed instantly. Others suffered injuries that would never fully heal, physically or emotionally. But Olga didn't flee the scene. She didn't fight. She stepped out of the vehicle and waited. When officers arrived, they found her standing nearby, her expression calm, her voice clear. There was no malfunction, she told them. This was my decision. She didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She spoke like someone reporting a routine fact, as if the horror around her was merely the result of a long-delayed plan coming to life. There were no cars, no trams, nothing in the way. I said to myself, this is the time. Investigators were left stunned, not just by the crime, but by the lack of feeling behind it. She didn't seem proud. She didn't seem ashamed. She was just resolved. To those studying her behaviour, this wasn't the signature of someone caught in a moment of madness. This was something far more difficult to comprehend, calm cruelty. The kind that's born not in fire but in frost, slow, deliberate and remorseless. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment tragedy. It was a long, cold decision planned by someone who had once been invisible, until she forced the world to see her. She didn't run. She didn't fight. She didn't even flinch when the police arrived. Olga Hepnarova stood exactly where she had chosen to end her silence. Not hiding, not confused, just present. No excuses, no panic, no protest. It was like watching a play she'd rehearsed, every movement precise, every breath calculated. And in many ways it was. By the time her trial began in 1974, the chaos of that July morning had already begun to settle into uneasy memory. But the courtroom didn't erupt into outrage. Instead, it fell unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that comes not from calm, but from disbelief. Here was a 23-year-old woman, still unreadable, sitting across from a society trying to make sense of what she had done. No dramatic gestures, no emotion. Just a young woman with a calm expression and a history that made people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Her defense attorney came prepared, medical records, psychiatric reports, a paper trail of emotional detachment and mental instability that dated all the way back to her early teens. But Olga wanted none of it. She didn't argue, she didn't beg, she didn't deny. She told the court she knew exactly what she had done and that she didn't need anyone to speak for her. If society destroys individuals, she said, staring ahead, then individuals can destroy society. It wasn't a defense, it was her verdict, delivered not in fury, but in the same cold tone she had used when police first arrived. There was no mystery to untangle. The evidence was clear. Her letters, mailed before the attack, spelled out her intent. Eyewitnesses were present. There was no doubt about what had happened, but that didn't make the questions any easier. What do you do with someone who believes destruction is their only remaining voice? And what does it reveal about the world around them if they might not be entirely wrong? People outside the courtroom debated endlessly. Some saw her as monstrous. Others whispered that maybe this had always been coming, that maybe, just maybe, something had been breaking for a long time, and no one had wanted to look too closely. For legal experts and psychologists alike, Olga's case didn't fit into any neat category. She wasn't delusional, she didn't suffer from hallucinations, she didn't lash out for attention or recognition. There were no explosive warning signs, no escalating outbursts, just years of quiet detachment. Then, one final, calculated decision. She had studied her plan, chosen her words, accepted the outcome before it ever unfolded. It wasn't chaos, it was control. And that made everything harder to explain and far more terrifying. Eventually, the court delivered its conclusion. On April 6, 1974, Olga Hepnarova was found guilty. No ambiguity, no alternative theory, just a clear judgment based on her own words and actions. Appeals were filed, all denied. Her mother submitted a desperate plea for clemency. The Prime Minister refused. The date was set, March 12, 1975. To the press, Olga appeared ready. She spoke with composure. She accepted the verdict. She said she understood what was coming. But when that day arrived, when the moment could no longer be abstract, something changed. As the cell door opened, her mask cracked. She collapsed. Her body shook. She cried. She begged. The calm that had followed her through months of proceedings suddenly vanished, replaced by a raw and human terror she had never shown before. But the machine of justice, once in motion, does not stop. And so that morning, Olga Hepnarova ceased to be a defendant. She became something else. A case study, a page in the law books, a name spoken in university classrooms, forensic psychology programs and documentaries exploring the anatomy of alienation. Her life, once almost invisible, was now etched into history, not because of who she was, but because of what she chose to do. And her name didn't fade. It lingered. In reports, in lecture slides, in hushed discussions about mental health and societal neglect. A reminder of what can happen when pain is left to ferment in silence. In the years since, people have tried to explain her. Some see her as a tragic example of untreated trauma. Others call her a vessel of revenge, someone who absorbed cruelty until she couldn't hold it anymore. But perhaps the most haunting realization is this: Olga's life didn't look that unusual until it ended in violence. She didn't belong to any radical movement. She didn't write a manifesto. She didn't threaten or harm anyone before that day. Her past wasn't explosive. It was quiet. There were no flashing lights, only dim signals, faint but there. She stood at tram stops for hours, staring, walked the same paths every evening, said little, asked for nothing, and no one ever asked why. When she finally did something that made people notice, it was already too late. Her case marked a turning point. She was the last woman ever executed in Czechoslovakia. And after her death, the conversations began to shift, quietly but persistently. People started asking harder questions, not just about crime and punishment, but about loneliness, about the kind of suffering that doesn't scream. Because Olga never shouted. She lingered. She waited. She hoped, maybe, for someone to notice. But that moment never came. By the time she forced the world to see her, everything had already changed. What she did cannot be excused, but the deeper question, what might have been done differently, has never stopped echoing. Olga Hepnarova's story isn't just about destruction. It's about the consequences of being overlooked for too long. It's about a society that mistook silence for peace. And it's a chilling reminder, even in the quietest lives, storms can still be building.